Thanks for joining this session. So my name is Vikas Sangwan, and I lead the services team in Salesforce. And engineering services team in Salesforce, actually, we help our Scrum team to be more agile, to increase their velocity. And we build a lot of tools and automation around CI/CD automation, DevOps automation. And with me, I have Vamshi and Michael from my teams.
Hello, everybody. I'm Vamshi Gandham. I'm the solution architect with the services engineering group at Salesforce. Good to see you all here.
And hello, I am Michael Johnson. I am a services engineer with GitHub, and I had the privilege of working with these fine gentlemen for a while on what we're about to talk to you about. I'm excited to be here to talk to you.
Okay, so this presentation is to talk about how to bring the large migration, how to do the large change. This doesn't talk about how to manage the GitHub Enterprise infrastructure at scale. So this is more about how to bring this change in the organization. And change of tool is very, very hard, especially when it is a developer tool which they are used to use from last couple of years. And it's even much more harder when you bring the large number of users into the whole picture. And another thing which add another dimension in the complexity is how many enterprise functions you have to collaborate with. For example, SOCs will have their own compliance requirement. Security will have their own compliance requirement. So how do you make all these changes with all these things? So in this presentation, we are going to talk about some of the strategy we used, some of the best practices which we learned across the migration, and we will also show you how our rollout plan look like. One of the principles which we used to make it easy for anybody to do the changes to reduce the friction. So what we did in our migration is to create the automation, create the tools, to make it so easy for our customers so that they cannot afford to not use it. So we'll share some of those practices also. Finally, Michael will share how GitHub Professional Services, how they can help you to go in this journey. For us, it was very, very useful, and I'm sure you will also find useful for your journey also. So how many here know about Salesforce? That's good. So I don't have to spend a lot of time on this slide. So Salesforce, as a customer success platform, we help our customer to serve their customer in a very nice way. And what you see here, these are the different offerings from Salesforce. We provide the offering for the sales, for services, for anything you can think which touch the life of a customer. So this scale actually is not just based upon how many customers we are helping with. The scale is also based upon how many transactions is actually going through our platform. So this picture shows a single day transaction happening. So even today, in this year, 2018, the target is to have around 1.9 trillion transactions going through the Salesforce customer platform. For us, this is not a platform. For us, this is the change which we provide to our customer to help their customer meet their business need. So if you look on the left side, B2C, we are sending around 1.4 billion emails every day. And if you look on the right side, on the B2B, we are sending around 5 million cases every day logged into our service platform. So to deal with this kind of business, you need a lot of strength and you need a lot of muscles. Now, within Salesforce, we have the Basic team, which actually help our businesses teams like sales, our marketing team, our CSG team, to give them the strength to deal with this kind of business. And my team, the services engineering team, we provide them the muscles to build the automation around those tools, to build the automation around CI/CD, to build the automation around the developer productivity tools, to help them deliver all this value to our customers.
So as a part of this journey, we kind of like set on ourselves some guiding principles to drive this project. And the most important thing for us was to make sure that there is no impact to the business. And what this means for us is there are a lot of projects that are in flight, and there shouldn't be any interruption for them. So that was one of the most important things for us. And that led to us this eventual goal of having a shared and common understanding across all the stakeholders. And it is super important to have that alignment before we begin this journey. And the other thing is, as a part of this, rollout project, since this is a very huge impact, we kind of wanted to do it in a scalable fashion. And the model we chose was to have a self-serviceable approach to, facilitate this migration by the end users itself. And we'll speak to those details in a minute. But part of this, any such change management that is involved in an organization, especially when there are aspects and processes related to it, we need to ensure that there aren't any gaps or any probability to have any sort of friction that might manifest. So that leads us to a path where we want to prefer automation over to manual configuration and manual steps. So overall, the objective was to keep things simple and automate as much as possible and keep it an open door thing so that your end users really love to do things what they would like to do. So let's hear from Vikas a little bit more about how that rollout was looking for us back then.
So let's go into some little bit of details now. So as it was a huge change for us, we need some big decision around how do we want to organize our team, how do we want to bring the change into this big organization. So engineering services team is a very small team. It's not a huge team, and we didn't had a big budget for like multi-year project to do this migration. So we came with the concept called core teams, where we took the people from all the partnership team so that we can create a kind of a virtual team to do this rollout. So what you see in the middle is that is the engineering services team, which is the kind of the DevOps team. What you see on the right around it, we had the representation from the Scrum team, we had the representation from the compliance team, security team, and tech enablement team, and the release management. The release management might be not familiar for all of you, but for people who are familiar with the Force.com technology, release management is a very integral part of Force.com technology. And we as a Salesforce, we believe in drinking our own champagne. So within our company itself, we use our Force.com platform to develop our application also. So that's where you see the release management. And what you see on the right side, we had the Scrum teams. We had around 70 Scrum teams. So we had presentation from each of the Scrum teams. So what it created, we created the concept of GHE champions. So all the people who were part of the core team, they were becoming GHE champion, and they were helping us to scale this whole rollout in a much more larger way. So the GHE champions, they were responsible for talking to their team to ensure that they're aligning to the common goal. And then we were bringing everybody together in the core team meeting once in 2 weeks to decide what do we want to do as a core team, what design decision we want to make, and how do we want to roll out the whole thing. So this was the team structure. Then, based upon that team structure, we came up with the rollout plan. What do you see here in the blue lines? Those are the actual migrations. So we divide the whole migration into multiple releases. So there was around 5 or 6 releases. What you see on the screen right now is only 6-month plan. The project went, I think, for 9 or 10 months. What you see in the gray color is the implementation work before we actually do the migration. So what we saw in the previous screen, the center team, the team was doing the implementation around automation, defining the best practices. The yellow color shows when the actual migration is happening. We started engaging with those teams which are actually migrating to help them coming up to speed. And the green is actually the hypercare, where after the migration is complete, we work with the team very, very closely to make sure they're after the release process is working smoothly after this migration. So we started with the pilot implementation. So what we did in the pilot implementation, we choose a couple of teams as a sample. And that sample was a very good distribution of all kind of the work BizTech team is doing. So we had teams which were building on Force.com, which has teams which were building on Node.js and on Java. Similarly, we had teams which were migrating from Perforce to GitHub. And we also had the team which were migrating from GitHub.com to GitHub Enterprise. So this was a very good distribution. And given that it was the pilot implementation, our team, engineering service team, was very closely involved with doing the migration itself. So we implemented some of the automation in the pilot, like repo creation, again to ease the movement. But it was not like fully automated. So every release, we were adding the more automation, and we were moving towards the self-service. The idea here was, there should be no need for this DevOps team to actually do the migration. All the apps team, they should be able to do the migration by themselves. And finally, we keep on adding more and more automation. For example, in R2, we add the auto integration, which was required by some of our force.kim. Now, we had the team structure in place, we had the plan in place, but we also need some kind of rollout strategy so that we can ensure that this change is happening very, very smoothly. Now, one of the strategy we implemented in the beginning itself is we wanted to have the early partnership with all the required enterprise functions. Salesforce is a huge organization, and our business technology is also very big. And we need to ensure that whatever change we are bringing, it is not impacting the security processes, compliance processes, or release management processes in any negative way. All these three functions, they can be your best friend or they can be your biggest hurdle. So if you want them to be your best friend, it's very important to engage them as early in the process, bring them on the page, so they can be actually advocate of your change for the rest of the teams. Second thing we implemented as a strategy is to create this self-service migration playbook. As I mentioned, we were a very small team, even though we had the core team member philosophy. We wanted to make sure that apps team, they can do the migration by themselves without involving us. So we did a lot of automation. We created a very clear and simple playbook which had the examples and everything mentioned in that. And that was a guide for anybody who wanted to do the migration. So this helped us tremendously. Third thing, which goes hand in hand with the playbook, the idea was when we create the playbook, there should be only minimal manual steps. So basically, we had only 3 steps: pre-migration step, migration scripts, and post-migration steps. So basically, the team has to do the 3 migration scripts to do the migration. One thing which I think was very helpful for us was to have a lot of communication with all the Scrum teams. We had the core team meeting every 2 weeks, where the core team members were talking to everybody else in the core team, and then they were going back to their team to discuss the decision and all the discussion points around that. But another thing we added was having the office hour every month. So in this office hour, think of it as an open house for this migration, where we invited all the Scrum teams who used to come in this office hours. So any question they had, any concern they had, any suggestion they had around their design, we used to discuss those in this office hours. Finally, to make it much more easy for them, we had a concept of train the trainer. So we first train our GHE champions, and they then themselves actually train their team member. And GitHub Services, actually, they created apps for us called Pro Teacher, and that app was very, very useful. This app actually run on the browser. It create a sandbox for the GitHub instance. So anybody using that app can go and they can create a new org, they can create a new repo, and they can play, delete, and everything. So you're not touching any actual repos. You can play with your own sandbox. That was also very useful for us.
Thank you, Vikas. So it's great that we kind of defined all these different capabilities, tools, and steps. Now that when I, as an end user, want to do the actual migration, how do I win the confidence factor that my journey in the target platform would be seamless? And to that end, this relates to the yellow legend that Vikas mentioned in this previous slide, early engagement, wherein we asked all the end users to do something called as dry run, kind of like a dress rehearsal that you all are aware, where they get to create a sandbox, try out different things, and see if there is anything that they have missed out or some edge cases and so on and so forth. And that gives them an opportunity to test the waters. So that was kind of very useful for all our end users to actually go do the thing in a target environment before you switch to a different plane. So the next one was more about the migration approach itself. And there are 2 critical aspects that I wanted to share here today. The first thing is we chose the approach of not traveling on 2 different SCM systems, like on the legacy system as well as the new GitHub Enterprise platform. And the reason for that is you'd be, again, ending up with a lot of complexity to stream the changes back and forth. So the recommendation on that is do a clean cutover to your target system by choosing some cutoff timeline. And while doing that, the other important decision we made in this particular transition was not to bring in any history into the GitHub Enterprise instance. And there are a couple of reasons for that. So historical audits require really high fidelity history. And this particularly relates to Git's data structure, how this metadata is retained within GitHub versus your legacy SCM system. And if you choose to bring in such history or metadata, you would be adding a lot of complexity to your migration. So that brings in this aspect of, okay, even if you decide to bring in that history, how long does an end user typically need it? And we found that in most of the scenarios, they wouldn't need this more than a couple of weeks. And hence we decided to recommend users not to bring in such metadata and history. And if they do need it, they can always go back to the legacy system, which was live for a few days or few months, and refer to it. So in the new target system, we started off with this migration as an approach where we took the branch that is representing your production instance and tagged it or sticked it to the master branch in GitHub. And any of your branches that are in flight or your releases that are in flight, they represent to be a lower level branch within your GitHub system. So the next part is, I think, a little bit more interesting and near and dear to me. This is more about the tooling we have created to facilitate this migration and some of the customizations that may be relevant to you. The first one I would like to talk about is the automated merge to lower branches. And this is something that you may see on a day-to-day basis at your work. So when you have a bunch of end users, a bunch of developers, maybe in the same location or across different locations, and you're working on concurrent release swim lanes, and say a release was shipped out, like say release 1, right? You do want to stream those changes into your rest of your open branches. And it would be nice to actually facilitate this in an automated way. And we have chosen to leverage GitHub APIs, webhooks, and some custom tooling to facilitate this as a service within our CI system. So this is a fundamental use case that you may run into on your GitHub Enterprise instance. And this is, again, totally a subjective thing based on the workflow you choose, the kind of release artifacts, the mechanism you apply to it. And specifically, if you're a Force.com developer, you will certainly find a lot of value in it. The next one I would like to talk about is some of the control mechanisms we have chosen to implement. And they may relate more or less related to some approval mechanism in your organization, wherein you are kind of like seeking some approvals, maybe in the form of a pull request review, or some form of an approval from a change management, so on and so forth. So that's one use case. And the other use case is we wanted to be sure that whatever was tested in our UAT or stage environment is the one that is being deployed to the production instance. And there are no changes that are happening between this window. Especially this becomes important to you if there is a lot of lag between the time when you complete your testing in stage environment versus the time you ship this to production. And I won't get into the details of status checks, but you have a screenshot here that will give you a kind of an idea of what this is about. Now, the next obvious question that will come to the folks from compliance, especially at Salesforce, compliance is a very huge thing for us, is that, okay, how do we ensure that now that we have given this democracy to the end users to own the particular controls and workflow within the repositories, how do we ensure that they are not lifting off any controls, right? In a way, the answer to that particular thing was to leverage something called as pre-receive hooks. And this particular capability is a special feature on GitHub Enterprise instance. You wouldn't be seeing this on github.com. And what this enables us to do is whenever there is an event that's occurring on the platform, it's going to go and run a script that you have pre-configured to run some validations. And the way we have leveraged this capability is to ensure that nobody is lifting off the branch protection controls on the master. That's one. And two is commit signing. As you all are aware that in the GitHub platform, the ODZ and auth and mechanisms are a little bit different. and you could spoof as user X even though you're not X. And this prevents us from doing such kind of things. And last but not the least is more about a tool we created to automate the aspect of repository creation. And we have chosen to not to give that permission for everyone who has write access on the org or the repos to create some random repositories, and it would be a designated set of individuals. And in order for them to optimize their time, we have created a self-service tool where they would be able to go run this tool themselves and have the repos created on the target GitHub org. So with that, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Vamshi. And just as a brief reintroduction of myself, I'm Michael Johnson. I'm a services engineer with GitHub working on the professional services team. And there's a little bit of background for what we provide generally and I provide specifically as a services engineer is GitHub Professional Services goal is to try and help people launch into their initial use of GitHub Enterprise as well as GitHub.com kind of early in the implementation, or even if you need help kind of in the middle of your implementation phase of like, adopting GitHub.com. What I personally as a services engineer do is I kind of handle some technical assistance with GitHub customers. The first and kind of most obvious for us on this stage is migrations to GitHub. That includes migrations from legacy tool systems, as well as across different Git platforms, and even going from GitHub.com to GitHub Enterprise and vice versa. In addition to that, we also provide administrator mentoring for administration teams on GitHub Enterprise. And then, as well, in addition to that, we also provide integration tooling to other tools within the software development lifecycle. So very particularly, we focus very heavily on continuous integration and continuous deployment. And then if there are any extensions that need to be performed that aren't immediately provided as a first-class feature on GitHub, we also provide some development on the GitHub platform to help extend that to create additional validation and automation. And we also provide some more cultural transformation offerings to help customers adopt an inner source culture, which basically takes the advantages that we've learned as a major open source source control provider and help companies implement that behind their firewall. And then we work on workflow consultations, which is essentially helping development teams to take the most advantage of GitHub Enterprise and GitHub to help streamline their development workflow so they can focus on coding and kind of push the details of CI/CD and automated testing to their tools. The four that we primarily worked on at Salesforce together were migrations, a little bit of GitHub Enterprise admin mentoring, some API consultations, and a lot of workflow consultation with the developers. The five primary personas that I had the privilege of working with at Salesforce were compliance and security. This was kind of an effort to take what was already a very strong compliance culture at Salesforce and the great system of implementation that they had within their legacy system and ensuring that they were able to continue to be compliant as they moved to Git. So we kind of talked through a lot of the best practices and uses that a lot of other companies use with GitHub to remain SOX compliant was a main one for us. And in addition, we talked a lot about some token scanning and things like that. And we just recently, today, with our keynote, you heard some new advances that we've had with that, kind of with as a first-class feature as well. So the next persona that we talked a lot to was developers and the operations team. This was to ensure that as they moved to GitHub, because we're such a developer-centric platform, we wanted to make sure that we were unblocking development teams as much as possible, giving them a little bit more autonomy and the ability to configure their own workflows within certain bounds to ensure that they were still remaining compliant, and then also to kind of look at the competing interests and needs of a release management team that wants to ensure that with that increased autonomy, that they were still ensuring that quality code was being shipped, and that, especially on that force.com stack, that they were able to ensure that the deployments were happening, correctly and with a high level of quality. So that resulted in a lot of the automation tools that we were able to develop, that Vamshi mentioned, with the pre-receive hooks and the status checks. And with some of those, it actually required the involvement of the GitHub Enterprise admins. GitHub Enterprise at Salesforce is very large and serves a large number of developers outside of just the teams that we migrated over. And one of their very valid requirements is that any of the implementation that requires the actual configuration of the GitHub Enterprise instance as a whole needs to be standardized such that if we're going to be implementing that, it needs to be applicable to developers across the organization. So we worked with them to ensure that these tools were able to be a little bit more generic and configurable, not just to the teams that we were onboarding, but to the GitHub Enterprise users at Salesforce as a whole. And this brings me to the final group that I had the privilege of working with the most. That is the migration delivery team, this services team that Vamshi and Vikas led up. And it was a wonderful experience. We were able to work hand in hand with me being able to provide some GitHub expertise as well as some lessons learned from other companies across the globe, and their great knowledge and expertise with regard to requirements for working with Salesforce.com, as well as internal cultural needs, and all of the requirements from the many stakeholders that they had, and these very large-scale implementations. It's been some of the most rewarding work that I've been able to do as a GitHub employee, is working with Salesforce. And so with that, I think it's time to talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned and what we achieved in this time.
Thank you, Michael. And here is a snapshot of some metrics, what we achieved out of this migration. The numbers that you see up on the screen are probably like about 6 to 8 months old. But today we are now around like 80 Scrum teams, sitting in 410 plus repositories, and the members around across all these repositories, the members on this org is around 600 plus. So this was a very transformational change for us, and some of the outcomes we have seen after this particular migration is that, more importantly on the DevOps side, this has actually opened up new doors to build better tooling and automation to enable our CI and CD pipelines. Particularly when we talk about force.com platform, there are aspects where you might be capturing the metadata version or the metadata API version number. And as you move from every major release from Salesforce X to Y, you are probably expected to keep up with the version numbers of the metadata version numbers. So one of the tooling that was developed by one of the team in our department was that they were able to actually reduce the time required to update these metadata version numbers across the entire code base from a span of about 40 days to 3 days. And the reason for that is, in the legacy system, we had a lot of complexity around the aspect of creating branch and shipping these things into the production, which was reduced by leveraging the APIs that are available on the GitHub platform. So that ultimately also helped us to rethink about how we were doing the deployments into the production and other controlled environments. And that has helped us to reduce the time required to perform a deployment from 4x to 15x. And that's a significant win for all of us. And that also led us to some sort of aspects where we were able to reduce the boundaries between different parts of the organization, specifically between the development and operations. And that's a huge win for us. All this boiled down to a theme that we kind of put into a bubble called autonomy. And that's the biggest win for all of us, is to reduce their dependency on the cross-functional teams. As Michael mentioned earlier, one of the key features that is offered by professional services team is cultural transformation. And we do see that thing happening in terms of embracing aspects around inner source, and also it gave us an opportunity to improvise our legacy processes. So that's in a nutshell about our transformation. Thank you.
So we wanted to leave about 10 minutes for a little bit of question and answer if you have any questions about the details of our implementation. It is a little bit noisy up here, so if you can speak up, we'll try and kind of repeat that out so everybody else can hear it. Yeah?
Where did you migrate from?
I think that... Sorry, there was a lot of background noise.
Yeah,
I think the question was...
So the question is, what do we migrate from? So we migrate primarily from Perforce, but we also had teams using GitHub Online. So we migrate them also to GitHub Enterprise.
Yeah.
Why did you migrate?
So I think Vamshi just touched base some of the examples here. So the reason we migrate, we were not able to get the agility which we were looking for from the Perforce. It didn't have the API-based infrastructure where we can write tools on top of Perforce. To have the tools like, he was giving you the example of partial delivery in force.com. So before we had this, it was taking a couple of hours, like 40 hours to do that delivery. Now teams are doing it into 3 hours, that kind of same time delivery. So the moving faster, have the agility, increase the velocity, developer productivity, these are some of the reasons why we migrated actually.
Yes.
You need to be a little loud, sir.
Hi.
You want to take it?
Get that question?
Yeah. So if I understood you right, your question is more about what was the infrastructure requirement to move from Perforce to GitHub? Okay. So as Michael was explaining in his slides, this team was not managing the GitHub infrastructure. We had another team within Salesforce, which is part of our core platform team. They manage the GitHub Enterprise. So we have team members here, actually in this room. If you are interested, we can definitely connect you with those and we can discuss those things.
Yeah.
Sure. So Force.com today is actually a big monolithic piece of software, and we are in the process of migrating the whole core into microservices. That's happening right now. But today, if you have a Force.com deployment, it's actually the whole org get deployed as a single go. Having said that, we had the teams which were using Java, Node.js, and they did have their own microservices also. So one principle which we touched base a little bit in the presentation was to have it simple, have it open. So we decided to have a single org for the whole BizTech technology. So anybody who want to look at each other repo, they want to contribute, they can easily do that. So to answer your question, yes, we had a combination of microservices as well as the big pieces. Sorry, I can't hear you. Want to talk about that code freeze?
Yeah, so I think the question was, what were the challenges to keep these 300 different plus repositories in sync? And the answer to that is multifold. At any given point of time, I as an end user, as a developer, I am not working on all these 300 plus different repositories. I am probably focused on, primarily on my prime services that I contribute to and tertiary services that I have dependencies to. So to that end, in terms of syncing between the remote instance and local, we had created tools that will enable you to kind of like automatically stream the changes on a scheduled frequency to your local workstation. So I hope that answers your question.
Is the question is how do we validate everything is working fine?
Yeah, so I think the question
Do you want
was,
to repeat that?
sorry?
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was more about once this sync happens, how do we validate it? This is more to do with the aspect of how the repo naming conventions are framed. We didn't get into a lot of those details here, but imagine you had some pretext notion of having some naming conventions to your repos, branches, so on and so forth. And the tool that we have created to do the sync is going to focus on those things that you're interested in. Like, let's say I'm interested in regular expression XYZ, right? It's only going to focus on those things and stream those changes. And with regards to the validation, we haven't run into any such challenges so far. Yeah. Thank you.
You had a question over here.
That's a great question. I really like that. Michael, do you want to take that?
I can't speak too much for Salesforce in terms of their open sourcing policies. We actually provide a lot of services associated with that as well. There are some platform samples repositories that do have some kind of already open source pieces for those kinds of things. I can definitely talk with you offline as far as some details on that.
For Salesforce, we do have concept of supporting the open source community. As part of our team, we have already open sourced something called Apex Unit, which is the unit testing tool for testing the force.com classes. And these tools also, if we see a big, I think, need, definitely we'll be more than happy to discuss that also.
Yes. Sorry, I can't hear the question. Can you please be a little bit loud?
Sorry, can you please repeat that?
The question is about rolling out changes. How to do that in a gradual way, and how GitHub Enterprise helped that process.
So how we did the rollout and how it really helped us?
Are you talking about release management on code bases as they are going?
Yeah, so we did share a little bit of our rollout strategy. The biggest thing which help us, I think, is to have to do as much planning as you can do. And then make it very clear to the partners team like how the rollout will look like. Third principle which we shared was to make it easy, to make it to reduce the friction. For example, we started with very small and less critical pieces in the pilot. Then we moved to R1, R2, R3 releases. Again, the complexity was increasing slowly. So we tried to do the easy piece first. We tried to do the less critical, less complex pieces first. And whatever lesson we were learning there, and we were applying those into the validating that everything is working fine into the later releases. So that's how I think was very helpful for us.
Yeah, and to add to that, within each release, we had multiple waves, release trains, and end users had the autonomy to choose which train they wanted to hop on. And specifically, the dry runs were really super useful for them to go test the waters. And specifically, if say you have some CI/CD scripts that are pointing to your old SCM instance that you didn't envision to have that abstraction built in, right? So that's an opportunity that gave them to do that abstraction at this point of time for such future things. At the same time, we also be able to foresee any edge cases that someone couldn't think of. So,
does that help your question?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
All right. Well,
We'll
thank
be
you
here.
very
If
much.
you have any other question, we'll be more than happy to give the answer for those questions.
Yeah. If you have any services questions, as far as professional services, we actually have an Ask Services booth upstairs. So thank you all.